Welcome to AASHTO Resource Q&A. We're taking time to discuss construction materials testing and inspection with people in the know, from exploring testing problems and solutions to laboratory best practices and quality management. We're covering topics important to you.
Welcome to AASHTO Resource Q&A. I'm Brian Johnson.
And I'm Kim Swanson, and we have another one. It's the first of this season, but it's another common findings episode. Which one are we talking about? What standard are we talking about today, Brian?
We're talking about everyone's favorite standard, AASHTO R18, the basis and foundation of AASHTO accreditation.
It is. And so that means that everyone in the AASHTO accreditation program is accredited to AASHTO R18. So this is a very wide-reaching episode, I hope.
It should be. And I did want to mention, if you had not heard yet, this is episode 3 of season 5, and this is available not only in audio form but also video, so you can see us staring at a screen or a camera blankly while the other one talks, which is really exciting.
It's riveting. It's riveting video. So yes, go check out our YouTube channel. And so you can actually see this wonderful dynamic that Brian and I have. We're matching today, totally unplanned. So yeah, it's a great time. Go check out our YouTube video if you can.
Yeah, and that's not all. You can see what my basement office looks like in my house, and you can see the cell that we hold Kim in.
It does very much look like I am in a prison cell. It is just my living room or dining room, if I know what room I'm in. It's in my dining room, so it just happens to be a very blank wall behind me. So very exciting, but it does look a lot like a prison cell.
Yeah, so that's what you can check out on our YouTube channel.
Yes.
And I'm sure everybody is just frantically going to their computer to look that up right now.
I am sure everyone just stopped listening to however they were and went right to YouTube. So exciting things.
Yeah. All right. Let's get into it.
Yes.
Because we don't want to waste too much time. We're going to talk about common R18 findings. And we're going to do this a lot like we've done the other common findings episodes, where I ask Kim questions that she couldn't possibly know the answer to, and then she guesses. And then we see where it goes from there. So there will be some questions here, and you can kind of play along at home and see if you do as well as Kim does, or maybe better.
Yeah, I hope you do better than me. I hope everyone is playing does better than I, because I don't know anything. So this is going to be very exciting for me.
All right. So first, we're gonna ease you into this, and I will not ask the first question, but I'm going to tell you about the most common categories of findings. And they are calibrations, standardizations, verifications, checks, maintenance records, all of that stuff, which for the purpose of being concise, I am just going to call it calibrations, because most of our customers just call them that. They're not all categorized as calibrations, but I don't want to have to say that long string of words every time I mention this.
Okay. All right.
It gets tedious.
Duly noted. You're going to refer to them as calibrations, but it's everything that you just said. So got it.
Yeah, any equipment records. So this was a section of data that I pulled from our system over the course of, I think it was a one almost a tour. It was like a 2-year data set. And there were 3,717 findings written on calibrations.
Wow.
Next, it was training and competency evaluations, and there were 2,837 findings written on that. So that is typically the laboratories had not presented records on either training of staff or competency evaluations of staff. And that could be a number of issues going on that we'll get into. But those two categories were far higher than any other categories. And then below that, so I was somewhere around the 3,000 range there. And then the third one goes all the way down to 371. So that shows the
Whoa.
discrepancy. Yeah. Uh,
Wow.
so super common issues and then not as common for organizational issues. So that could be org chart wasn't updated, didn't have one, position descriptions were not in conformance with R18, a bunch of other things like that. And then we've got 306 findings on management reviews,
Okay.
which I thought that would actually be a little higher. People really struggle with that one. And then 216 for internal audits.
Okay.
And I think that shows progress on the internal audit front that there were not as many as management reviews because a lot of times those two are neck
Yeah.
and neck with each other.
Okay.
So those are the most common categories for R18 findings in general.
So for some context, there are over 2,000 laboratories accredited for AASHTO R18. So those numbers that were like the 3,000 findings or nonconformities, is that spread out over the entire 2,000 laboratories that are accredited?
Not exactly.
Okay.
So the way it worked is I pulled data from 2 years of assessment reports
Okay.
from AASHTO Resource and CCRL.
Okay.
So what that means is the laboratories that were assessed during that 2 year period, which right now our tour interval is longer than 2 years.
Okay.
So it doesn't cover everybody.
Okay. So it's even less. So
it's even less.
Okay. So these are, I'm going to say under 2,000 laboratories had the 3,000 nonconformities that you were talking about.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And
Okay.
what's interesting about that is you may have some laboratories with no findings in a particular category, and you may have some with 16 or more findings
Okay.
on that. So it's really it's very hard to get a sense of exactly what to expect if you were coming into the program based on these numbers. I
Okay.
don't think that would, because it's really dependent on how the laboratory manages the quality program
Okay.
in their facility. So I said I would add more information about what type of calibration issues there were, and I do have more data on that.
Okay.
So, and I think this is a little telling is, so there were 3,717 findings. 2,406 were just not presented. So there was a record straight up not presented. So they were operating with something just completely unknown. I wouldn't say out. So this is another misconception. People say, well, if they weren't calibrated, they must have been out. Not necessarily.
Correct.
It may have been fine, and they just didn't know if if it was or not. They didn't have a record to show that, which is not something you want to have as a policy, that we're just not going to do it and assume that it's in. Obviously, if you're accredited, you can't operate that way. But there are lapses that happen occasionally, and there are times when people can't find it at the time, which isn't good either.
Yeah.
But it's not as bad as not having it at all.
Yeah.
And then another big drop. So we go
Okay.
from about 2,400 to 544 that were missing results. So that could be maybe I'll use a thermometer because that's a typical one. Maybe they had a thermometer calibration record, but it didn't have the test points that were needed.
Okay.
So that would factor in on that count.
Okay.
Other ones, intervals not correct. So they might have had a 12-month interval when there was supposed to be a 6-month interval. And then some just details, missing equipment IDs of the calibration equipment, or missing the ID of the equipment itself, or misidentifying it. We've run into this issue occasionally where people they will replace a piece of equipment and give it the same ID number as the one that isn't there anymore. which you can't really do.
No, I don't think you can. That seems
No,
that seems like it would be very confusing.
it would be very confusing, and it's hard to tell what you used
Yeah.
in practice if that's
Yeah.
what you've done. But we've run into that more than a few times where people really
Okay.
they push back on that concept that each one has to have a unique identifier, but that's kind of the whole point
Yeah.
is that it has a unique identifier so you can trace back to what went wrong if something did go wrong or which equipment was used.
So going back just a little bit, you mentioned the intervals not being correct. Now, can laboratories have different intervals than what's stated in R18 if they have the record showing that they don't need to, like that they've proven that they can go longer or something like that? I believe I recall something like that. Am I wrong? Is this the similar? Is this relevant or no?
It is. You're absolutely correct. It is possible to change the prescribed interval if you have data to support it. And this can go either way. So let's say there's an interval that says I have to do something every 3 months,
Hmm.
and I have years of data showing that this is just too frequent. Like I never
Hmm.
see changes on this. I
Hmm.
want to extend it to 6 months or a
Hmm.
year. And if you have the data to support it, yeah, you can do that. And conversely, if you've got something that you're doing, say you're calibrating it every year, but every time you find that it's out of spec from overuse or misuse, you need to shorten that interval. And you don't need any special permission to do that. You've already proven that you needed to because you're not able to show that it's still in spec because it's either drifted out or there's some factor is playing
Yeah.
into it that you have not resolved. Or maybe you just do a ton of testing and it just needs to be shorter. So you can make those changes on your own.
Now, do you have to have policies and procedures in your QMS describing how and why you change your intervals for that, documenting that process, or
Um,
no?
you don't necessarily have to have a procedure written for how you did that, but you will have to show the data and
Okay.
show how you did it. There is an AASHTO standard that kind of takes you through that decision-making process,
Okay.
and you can follow that. I believe it's R61. See, now I'm going to have to check that and make sure that
Sorry.
that's accurate as well. Good news, it was R61. Other items with calibration include the lack of uncertainty on calibration records for measurement standards. There were 145 labs that did not have
Okay.
uncertainty, and 84 of them also did not have the 17025 accredited calibration,
Hmm.
which is probably why they didn't have uncertainty.
Yeah.
So those issues, people are still figuring out how to deal with that.
Hmm.
So, question for you.
Yes. Okay.
This is
Are
your
we
time to play.
okay? Ready?
What do laboratories typically struggle with when resolving calibration nonconformities?
I would say with proof of or evidence of that it was actually calibrated, like the corrective actions they took actually were taken. No, is that what you're
Right. Well,
asking?
that's a big part of it. I think a lot of times what happens is that they resolve part of it, or
Mm,
they don't really know what to do, and they
okay.
haven't looked back at all of the requirements. So
Okay.
these things are often layered. So
Okay.
you've got your R18 requirements, you've got your
Mhm.
requirements in the test method or
Mhm.
whatever other standards it's used in, and they may not look at those two items together to
Oh,
see, oh, what test points do I need?
gotcha.
Um, but as as it is with so many issues that occur, what a lot of times with the issues, the root cause of the
Mhm.
problem is not often identified,
Mm.
and a lot of it is communication.
Ooh.
Right. So
Okay. Yeah.
communication, I think if you're ever being asked about like what is important or what could go wrong, if you say communication, you're almost never going to be wrong because I feel like almost everything kind of comes down to that.
Yeah.
So typically what will happen with calibration issues is there's a lack of communication between the laboratory and the agency they
Mm.
hired to perform those calibrations. So,
Yeah.
or vice versa.
So that would be one of the things of that while the provider that they chose, the laboratory chose, may be 17025 accredited, they didn't ask for a 17025 calibration. Like, so they didn't get the information that they needed, even though they are accredited for it. The calibration agency is accredited for it. They didn't provide that level of service because it was not specified by the laboratory. Is that what you're kind of talking about?
That happens.
Hmm.
That is part of what I'm talking about. The
Okay.
other thing is, okay, well, the calibration agency should ask the laboratory, well, what points do you need? What are you
Mm.
using your equipment for? And then they can have that conversation about how to deliver the services that that laboratory needs. Another issue that we've found can happen is the calibration agency's technician might show up and perform the work, and they might find some problems and not communicate those to the
Mm.
laboratory, and then leave them with a bunch of records. Some saying that things are in specification, meet specifications, some
Hmm.
that don't. But if there's no communication about that, uh, those can just go right into a folder or into a
Yeah.
file on, even harder, a file on somebody's computer or
Yeah.
in an inbox and never looked at until it's too late.
Yeah. So it's just assuming that well, they didn't say anything, so it must be all within specification, which that's not always the case. So you need,
It's
so the laboratory has to actually like verify on the record what was actually said. They can't
that is
just,
correct.
they can't assume no news is good news in this instance.
Definitely not.
Okay.
And it is a challenge. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it's a lack of effort.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's just a lack of availability because the
Hmm.
people, the contact person at the laboratory might just be running around all the time,
Yeah.
and it's hard to find them. And the person's like, I have to leave these with somebody, or I have
Yeah.
to send this to them after the fact. And I mean, it's typically they'll send them the official one after the fact anyway,
Hmm.
but they might not be able to easily have that conversation that they need
Hmm.
to. But it, I don't know. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. That is a common issue.
Okay.
So, okay, let's get into training and competency evaluation.
All
So,
right.
what do you think the main issue was? There was one that with this. So
Okay.
we talked. There are a lot of
Yeah.
findings related to this.
Yeah.
This is number
Okay.
two,
All right.
with a big gap between two and three on training and competency evaluations. What is the main reason that this happened? Or not
All
the
right.
main reason, but
Yeah.
what was the
The
main issue?
I'm gonna take the lead from the calibration one and say records were not presented.
You
Is the
nailed it. Yes,
yes.
that is correct. So score one for Kim Swanson today. So most of them that they were just not presented. And then a big drop off, and this guy actually kind of surprised me, is that uh, so it was 2482 not presented, so 2,482 instances of a record not being presented, and only 355
Hmm.
times that a test method or practice was missing from the
Hmm.
record. So maybe they had a record for somebody, but it was missing
Mm.
one or two of the test methods that that technician performs normally. So this is another one of those areas where a laboratory can struggle due to not necessarily a lack of communication in this one, but just a lack of keeping up with what is going on at their laboratory. So
Okay.
they may have picked up a new technician,
Hmm.
or they may have started doing new testing and forgot to document the training.
Mm.
Uh, and they may not have a great system in place for doing that. One thing that we've been working on at AASHTO Resource is an onboarding process that is improved, and I think that would be putting together a checklist at your laboratory. And this is one of those things that's outside of R18. It's outside of all of the standards to have something like this, but you really have to think about those non-standard things that are helping you operate your quality management system better and implement those. So put a checklist together. When I hire somebody, this is what I need to do. And one of those things should be making sure that they have training records, making sure they've been trained on everything they're going to do for you.
Mm-hmm. And similar checklist of when you're adding a new test to the scope, right? Like of making sure, like, are the people trained? Do we have like documenting it? So not only with new hires, but with new additions to your scope of testing.
That's right. And you also, the ones that have done this really well typically will maintain a matrix on all of their staff and all of the tests that they perform or all the activities that they carry out. And that way they can easily keep track of who needs what and if they have any gaps in their what they are saying they offer and
Mm-hmm.
if they can actually deliver those services.
Yeah, and I think your clarification on the activities they perform and not just the tests reminds me of, I think, one of your pet peeves, maybe not, maybe I'm just projecting, but that assuming that a technician knows how to calibrate or check equipment based because they know how to run the test. And I think, isn't that something that, I don't know, I feel like
It
we've had a
is. It
conversation. I
is.
feel like we've had a conversation about that before.
We have. So that was the one of the main issues I was trying to get added to R18
Mm,
is that there needed to be a documented training for any technician who's being asked to also calibrate or what the other words I mentioned in the beginning, standardize, check equipment that they are using because that is often overlooked and often assumed by management that they will know how to do, but it is a quite different process than performing the test with the equipment. And
mhm.
so that there does need to be care taken to make sure that they know what they're doing before you just say, here, do this.
Yeah. But that is currently not in R18. That's just kind of a best practice that you should do, that laboratory should do.
That's correct, but it's so critical and it comes up so often that it to me it should be in R18. So we will continue to work on that and see if we can get that added. But uh, for those of you who understand how the AASHTO standards are developed, you'll know why that can't just be done.
Mhm.
And for those of you who don't, it's because I am a staff member at AASHTO. I do not vote on what gets added to the standards. So that it is the Departments of Transportation, materials engineers or their designees that make the votes on the additions or removals or edits to the AASHTO standards. So if the collective wisdom is to not include that, then it does not get included, even if I am trying to get a change made.
Yes, you can only do so much because it is consensus standards. So it is not just what Brian wants. It has
That's
to be a
right.
consensus.
It is the AASHTO standard, not the Bryan standard. And same with the AASHTO accreditation program. We are not operating based on my whims. There is a big process, and we've got
Yes.
tons of content on that, so I'm not going to get too into it. All right, let's move on.
Okay.
Uh, this is another issue that comes up, and this is related to ballots as well. So this is the opinion question, so there's really no right or wrong
Okay.
answer here.
Okay.
So given the amount of findings that we just mentioned on
Hmm.
this, do you think that the problem lies with the implementation of the requirement, or that there is a possible problem with the requirement itself?
Ooh. So me knowing nothing,
You
I'm
knowing
going to,
nothing.
me knowing nothing. This is great opinion. I'm gonna say, again, you said no right and wrong, but just from context clues, I would have a feeling that it's probably more in the implementation than the requirements, but it could be a good half and half. It could be a good mix of both. Like I don't think it's just one or the other, most likely. But if I had to lean, I would say it was implementation and lack of communication and lack of clarity on how to implement those correctly.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. on that one. And I know you say knowing nothing. You've been around. You've absorbed a lot of information that you might not want, but you have
Yeah,
over the years. And I think a lot of it is implementation based on the gross amount of findings that there are on this topic. However, I would say when you see an outlier, like I would say that because we're looking at these and the outliers are very high, but they are they're not just a case of like, oh, unlucky, you got unlucky there, and you got some nonconformities. There's some problems with it, how difficult it is for people to keep up with this stuff. So
hmm
it does make me wonder if there are some things that can be done to make it a little easier to conform. And not, when I say easier, I don't mean like, oh, well, it doesn't matter. We should just punt on this concept and people can just kind of do what they want. What I mean is maybe some of the specificity of the requirements is too stringent, and maybe there are some unnecessary items in
hmm
there in the details. Because ultimately, if I felt like people were still doing a great job and this is still coming up, I'd say, oh, it's definitely a problem with the requirement. I
hmm
don't feel that way.
Yeah.
There's definitely some improvements that need to be made with the quality of testing. Um, but I think that we do need to look at the standards anytime we see a large number of nonconformances, to see if there's some changes that can be made, and I
Yeah.
think that there are, but it's going to take some risks in loosen. Anytime you loosen anything up, you're taking on some risk, right?
Yeah.
So have to be some reflection and some consideration of what risks are willing to be taken on and whether they're worthwhile.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much we'd want to loosen up, but I think that there's probably some changes that could be made.
Yeah, and maybe it's not loosening up, but streamlining it and making it more, like you're not loosening it, but you're making that process easier. And so maybe they don't have to look at all of the other data point, like maybe it's just a consolidation of things in one area instead of loosening up, because I don't love that as a user, as the public, as using the benefits of the testing of just driving my car down the road and or across a bridge and not worrying about it collapsing. Um, I don't love the idea when you say loosening up, but I would agree that there's always likely opportunities to streamline the process and make it more clear and concise. But also knowing, like you said before, like, are you asking, are the requirements making a difference? Does it matter that it is like, is there data to support that it doesn't matter that you check this X, Y, and Z or something like that? So,
Yeah, and I think it's a mixed bag. There's some areas where I think that is very little evidence to support the need to do certain things. And there is plenty of evidence to support the need to do others. So it is a mixed bag, and we just have to keep thinking more about it and not just assuming that everything that is already the way it is there because it needed to be.
mm,
So that's all part of continual improvement
it is.
of these
It is.
processes. So we
Yes.
we we abide by that concept and we'll continue to work on that. Okay, for organizational issues, we've got 146 on the org chart, 146 findings on the org chart with 120 findings on position descriptions.
Okay. So with the org charts, why does it matter? Why does
Okay,
it matter that that's accurate and up to date? And like, why should the laboratories care about that?
there are a couple reasons why.
Okay.
So number one, they need to know what their organizational structure is at that
hmm
laboratory, and it's good for everybody on their staff to know what that is. Uh, Number two, it is a way for them to keep track of who is working there
hmm
and who is under each person on the org chart. So who's supervising whom, and and how all of the different departments relate to each other. The third reason is because it also helps identify the requirements for certification.
Mm.
So if you've got a requirement for the technical director to have a PE license, then we would want to see if that is the case. Is there a technical director identified on the org chart? And if so, does that technical director maintain a PE license?
Because I was asking because I can see where part of my job sometimes is the paperwork. And I'm like, if I don't get why it is, I mean, not this type of paperwork, but if I don't understand the reason why it's important that this is up to date, that's moving to the bottom of my to-do list and I'll get to it when I get to it. So I think it's helpful for laboratories to know why it's important that that's up to date, because it's not just a hoop you have to jump through. It's actually useful information, not only for accreditation, but for in their day-to-day laboratory practices.
It is, and I would say there are elements of it where they're just not good at the paperwork part, right? Like sometimes people are terrible with the software that you have to use to make an org chart. As simple as drawing the lines, connecting these different boxes of staff members, and how do I organize? Our organization is really complicated. How do we make it look like this makes sense? One thing I don't love is that sometimes people will have one and then they'll make us a special one
Mm.
to make it easier. What they think is easier to show conformance, which sometimes that means that, and this is not allowed, that they not that we would know. This is the hard part. Sometimes we wouldn't know if you're doing
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
But what can happen is sometimes they will remove people from the org chart that aren't certified so that we don't go
Mm.
asking about whether that person is certified or not. And you can't do that. So that is you are basically hiding someone or not disclosing some information that you need to disclose. There are other issues that occur too, like they don't know who is in charge of the technician. So you might have a complicated situation where, well, it depends on the project.
Mm.
So for certain projects, this engineer is in charge of what they do, the quality of work that they do. And on this project, it might be somebody else. And you've got to figure out how you want to structure that. Maybe
Mm.
you have a
Okay.
box of supervisors and then they all go down to the technicians. That would be
Hmm.
fine. You
Hmm.
can that's one thing I want to make sure people understand too, is that it's okay for us to ask you questions about, okay, well, how would this work? Or can you
Hmm.
explain this in more detail? In some cases, you may have to add some kind of note to your org chart, or maybe you just have to have a document that supports it to kind of include those little details. Or
Hmm.
sometimes it's just going to be an explanation that you give us every time, and you might get tired of doing that. But it's if you do get tired of doing that, you can just document it. But maybe you do need just some questions. But where we've seen some real problems occur is where you've got a quality manager that's not really connected to the rest of the organization,
Hmm.
and that is going to lead you down a path that is not quality oriented. Uh, and I would not like to see that. Like ultimately, the quality needs to be in line with the operations and the performance at that laboratory. So you never want to have a situation where, oh, we just have this quality person that kind of checks in here and there, gives some feedback, and then they're not really involved
Hmm.
other than that.
Yeah.
Um, they need to be able to enact change.
Hmm.
Because if you are focused solely on productivity without quality, then you cannot maintain that quality mindset that you need in order
Hmm.
to continually improve and to maintain your accreditation ultimately.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Thank you for clarifying all of that for me. and our listeners, not just me. I hope our listeners got something out of that because my day-to-day is not going to change, but hopefully this prompts somebody in a laboratory to take meaningful action.
Yeah, you'd hope so. But if you have any other any questions about that, you can talk to any of your quality analysts or me or Amy, or even Kim. I mean, she's
apparently. I will say you mentioned how people don't like making the org charts. I will say I am a PowerPoint evangelist. I love PowerPoint, and they actually do make it very simple to connect boxes and lines together. And you can change the orientation to be portrait instead of landscape in PowerPoint as well. So you can do it. I'm sure there are YouTube tutorials on that as well if you have questions about it. But I find that's the easiest way to make org charts for me in my needs is in PowerPoint.
All right, next we're going to get into management reviews, which is a common issue, but not as common as I expected. I think it's just because each lab only has one management review, right? So you're only going to have one or two findings on this one, whereas you could have a multitude of ones on calibrations or training or copy vals. So anyway, 218 just didn't present management reviews, which is not at all surprising to me, because people still struggle to figure out what the management review is. And in light of that, now Kim, you have experienced some management reviews. You've participated in them. You have read them. You have been involved with them a lot. So, in your opinion, what are the biggest misconceptions that you think exist about what a management review is?
Well, I will say from all of the webinars I've been a part of with Tracy Barnhart, our quality manager, talking about this, that I will say one of the big takeaways for me is that a management review is an input into an internal audit. They both look at the big picture, but it's different, as in the management review is an input to an internal audit. But I think you asked what the biggest misconceptions were about it. I will say the frequency that you have to do them. I don't know. I don't feel strongly about that answer, but I'm going to say frequency.
Okay. That's part of it. And I wouldn't say the frequency necessarily, but the when do we do it in relation to the internal audit?
Oh, okay.
So that is part of it that people struggle with. Like, okay, we scheduled our internal audit and our management review on the same day. That's not going to work because those are two totally separate things.
Well, as one is the input to the other, so you can't really have an internal audit before your management review because that would be an incomplete internal audit, would it not?
Well,
maybe.
No, I mean, you can talk about the last one, right? Like
I guess that's true.
So they're both inputs of each other in a way. So when when we're having a management review, we will talk about the internal audit results, the last internal audit results, and how did we do on that, and what were there any? How do we do on our improvement opportunities? And you can talk about all sorts of stuff related to the last internal audit. And during your internal audit, you're gonna check to see if you conducted your management review last year and did you resolve nonconformities from that. So you do talk about them in relation to the other. So that part is kind of interesting. But with the management review, I think a lot of times people just confuse it with the internal audit because of the way. And this is an area where I would say R18 is partially to blame because the wording used to describe the management review makes it sound like it might be some kind of audit, and it really isn't. So it's more of Tracy, I think, aptly describes it as kind of the State of the Union address for your laboratory. So you take all this stuff, quality related issues and otherwise, it could be productivity, it could be acquisitions, facilities, could be all kinds of different stuff. And you present it to top management. And it gives them an opportunity to ask you questions, to give you the go ahead on making some changes or spending some money or using some resources that you didn't know you had. And it just kind of like closes the loop on the organization between your laboratory quality and operations and top management. Because we do, if you're wondering why that matters, uh, if you don't do that, you're going to have some serious issues keeping up with everything. And we have seen that laboratories that don't do a good job with management reviews often can't keep up with their expectations because they're not allowed to spend money on anything. And it might not even be that they're not allowed to, it's that management was never informed. So get back to communication that we talked about at the very beginning of this.
Yeah.
If top management that has to make the decision to allocate resources isn't informed that resources are needed, they're never going to come to you and say, "Hey, I got a great idea. Why don't you blow a bunch of money on this stuff I don't know anything about?"
Yeah, no, that won't happen.
Instead of spending it where they do know where it's needed, right? So it's really important that that communication loop is closed, so that things can just function properly.
Yeah, and I do know that we have, and correct me if I'm wrong because my brain might be misconstruing things, but we do have a policy on for new laboratories gaining accreditation that we don't expect them to have a management review right away or an internal audit right away. Am I correct on that? I feel like we had an episode on that, but can you
are
explain that?
correct.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Can you
so we
explain that
do.
more?
I can. Yeah, we allow 6 months kind of leeway for them to operate. So if they're a new laboratory and they're trying to get accredited, we don't expect them to have conducted a management review or an internal audit before they're even working, because they really haven't had anything to evaluate yet. So we give them some time to do that so they can get accredited, and then 6 months later, we would expect them to send us their completed internal audit, and we'll have conducted a management review. Now they can do it anytime in that time period, and but they have to at least show us that they know what it is and that they've had a run through at least once.
Yeah, and that's definitely an instance of don't perform them on the same day. Don't wait
No.
to the last day. Maybe do the management review at 3 months and then at, 5 months do the internal audit or something like that to make that work appropriately, because that will be a red flag if you said you did them on the same day.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's okay. You can do them however you want because the real value is going to reveal itself later on anyway. You're going to see it in the subsequent ones in the next year, the next 2 years, next 3 years, and so on. And things should change over time. Like don't just make this a static activity. Think about how you're doing it. And the management review is a good time to think about how you're doing it and ask around, is this working for us? Those kind of questions should really be asked during those management reviews. What else can we do? Does this make sense? Are we doing what we need to do? Does this follow our vision and mission? Those kind of questions are great if you've got them.
What's the next thing on the list about? That was management reviews. Internal audits is the last one, right?
Yeah, internal audits was the last one, and that's your basic expectations is that people haven't been doing them, or they're missing some details. Now, for R18, this is an area that I think needs some improvement. Is it says that the entire QMS needs to be audited. That that wording is going to lead some inconsistency on how that is carried out and how that is assessed. So I think that one thing that I would like to do with an R18 ballot upcoming is to actually list out, need to include this, this, this. And I think our list that we talked about today is a good start for what needs to be included in that. And actually recently somebody reached out to me and said, "Hey, I was written up for this aspect of, something was missing in the internal audit." And my immediate thought is, I don't know that I would have looked for that as an assessor. So I know that there's some improvements we can make in consistency of the way we're looking at this. That's something that'll be in an upcoming R18 ballot. It was in a past one that didn't make it through, but it wasn't related to that Exactly. One thing I did want to talk about with internal audit, so is some people who feel that they don't have time to perform an internal audit will try to hire a consultant to do that. And they ask, is that okay? And it's like, well, probably not, but it depends. I'm not going to say completely no on that because I'll use Tracy for an example. Let's say she retired
Mm-hmm.
and she said, you know what, I'm going to be a consultant now. And we say, oh boy, it would be really great because she's such a great internal auditor.
Mm-hmm.
She knows our system in and out. If we could hire her as a consultant to carry out those internal audits, can we do that? I would say absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a great option.
Mm-hmm.
But if we hired an external auditor that we see once a year to perform an internal audit, I would say no, that's probably not appropriate because that person is not going to have the knowledge required to carry out an effective internal
Mm-hmm.
audit. So
Yeah.
it's there, like a lot of things, there's no black and white answer on
Yeah.
that. It's just going to depend on the situation. But I would say if you're not sure, don't do it.
Channeling my inner Tracy Barnhart of nobody knows your business better than you. So that's the value of internal audits. And to challenge you, Brian, if you said you would hire, Tracy as a consultant, I think that's only going to work for a couple years because our
Yeah.
processes will change. So like that's not a long-term solution. That's a temporary band-aid on the situation where in 5 years she's not going to be as familiar as she is, right after. So
Yeah. And she's not going to want to do it anymore
no,
either. I know that for
I,
sure.
yeah, but in the made-up scenario
Right.
of that.
Yeah. So yeah, like I said, it's not a static thing. You got to constantly look at it and think about
Mm-hmm.
quality improvements.
Yep.
Other topics that have come up, not enrolled in proficiency samples, not reporting test method reports in accordance with the standards. Sometimes people don't have the up-to-date standards. That happened. Actually, that one I thought would have been a lot higher number, but it
Mm-hmm.
was only 44
Oh,
instances
that's
in
not bad at
there.
all.
Yeah, not bad at all. I think the subscription services has helped a
Mm-hmm.
lot in that
Well,
regard, is that more people are going to that so that if they need something, they can easily pull it up.
and I will say AASHTO standards are only available digitally now, so there are no hard copies
Yeah,
on that.
yeah,
Just an FYI in case people didn't realize that.
right. Yeah, that is good information because some people they still will call it the books,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yep.
then this may surprise people. So, in case you're wondering how many times falsified records showed up, only 38. I would say only 38. Should be zero, right? But
Yeah.
it's not, human nature is what it is. And there were 38 instances of falsified records that were documented in those findings over the course of 2 years.
And I will say that you said that's 2 years, but that's, over 1,500 laboratories, I'm going to assume, under
Yeah,
2,000. But
probably.
so that, I mean, a percentage wise, that's not horrible. But yeah, obviously in the continual improvement area, we would want and integrity and trust and all of that. We would like that to be zero. But you're right, human nature. There
Yeah,
always
and
be shady people doing shady things.
there will, and I will say we only write falsified if it's a really no question about it. So there are other
Hmm.
times where there might be some wiggly wording that was used by the assessors so that they were like did not appear, or something which was
Yeah.
kind of not conclusive
Yeah.
about the falsification. So there were probably more cases of it than just 38, but I that's another thing to watch out for on those internal audits. Kind of pay
Mm,
attention, like, why does this look like this? Why are these numbers so similar all the time? Kind of keep an eye on that. And
yeah.
as Kim said, you know your business better than anybody. You know your personnel better than anybody. You are
Yeah.
more than likely going to be able to figure out what's going on a lot better than an external auditor would.
Yeah, that was Tracy. I mean, I was channeling
Yeah,
my Tracy.
right,
I didn't.
right.
Yeah, okay. I'm not taking credit. That is all on our quality manager, Tracy Barnhart. But that it does bring up that your internal audits prepare you for the external audits, for the assessment. So there shouldn't be any surprises really in the assessment because you are doing the internal audit. You should be aware of those issues. Um, ahead of time and trying to fix those, or in the process of doing corrective actions for those based on your internal audit. So
That's right. Yeah, if you do a good internal audit, you should really not have any problem, and definitely don't be afraid of the external audit. They're not going to find anything that you haven't already found if you're doing a good job.
the internal audits for laboratories don't go over the specific test procedures, right? They don't do a demonstration of that, or do they? I can't recall.
They don't, but what they would do instead of that is look at the competency evaluations and
Okay.
the training records, and if they look at their training program, they should
Okay.
be made aware if there is a need for additional training before the actual external assessment. But yeah, things can come up.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times with the test demonstration is that people are running the wrong version of a standard. Maybe they have an old version of a standard that they've been trained on, and just,
Yeah.
sometimes just hard to break old habits.
Yep.
Or maybe they're using a state method or a Corps of Engineers standard or something else. So those kind of things can happen, and those are relatively minor issues, but it is possible to have a relatively clean report if you're keeping up with everything. We've seen it time and time again.
Anything else that we're going to talk about today? Because this is turning out to be a very long episode, I think.
Yeah, sorry about going so long on some of those things, but through the magic of editing, I'm sure you will be able to cut out some of the waste.
We'll see. We'll see how that turns out.
Thanks for hanging in there. I'm sure it's still going to be long, even if you cut it, but thank you for listening and checking us out on YouTube if you did that. And hopefully we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks for listening to AASHTO Resource Q&A. If you'd like to be a guest or just submit a question, send us an email at podcast@ashtoresource.org or call Brian at 240-436-4820. For other news and related content, check out AASHTO Resource's social media accounts or go to ashtoresource.org.